2022 drastically changed the global realities around energy. Between the war in Ukraine, fluctuating energy prices, Europe's energy crisis, and a steadfast commitment to a low-carbon energy transition, the future of energy no longer looks like it once did. But present within that changing reality is a new opportunity to be a global leader in the energy space, and it is now up to each country to decide how best to respond. Hey there, you're listening to the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On today's episode, we are joined by energy expert Jackie Forrest, the executive director at ARC Energy Research Institute, and the co-host of the ARC Energy Ideas podcast. We speak with Jackie about the future of Canada's energy systems, the opportunities and realities present in Canada's energy transition ahead of our 2030 and 2050 goals, and the challenges we must overcome to be successful. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show.
So, Jackie, many of us know you as a mastermind on all things energy business and energy issues and maybe energy transition here in Canada. And I'm an avid listener of your podcast, ARC Energy Ideas. But for anyone who hasn't met you before, Jackie, would you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself? Introduce yourself for us.
Okay. Well, hey, I maybe wouldn't describe myself as a mastermind, but I'm very glad you think that. So I'll go with that. And I just love energy. I've always been curious about energy, and I'm a chemical engineer by training, but very early on in my career, I got into the business side and started to think a little bit more about, the technical side, but how you can make money doing that. So for the last 20 years, I've really focused more on the business side and energy and research. It's a great job for me. And I used to get in trouble in school for talking too much. So my mother always laughs that now I actually get paid to talk. So
I do it for a living.
Yeah, I could get paid. So it's a perfect job for me. Really a bit of luck that I fell into something I really enjoy.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, we're going to tap into every bit of that mastermind, my words, not yours. Today, we're going to cover a whole wide range of topics from EVs and hydrogen to regulations and more. But one of the things I wanted to start with first is just sort of the broadest view. You've joined the Business Council of Alberta recently as a special advisor. And I think one of the huge issues of our time, maybe the issue of our time, is the energy transformation, the energy evolution. What do you see as the role of business in driving energy solutions?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for asking me to be a special advisor, and I'm really honored and look forward to getting more involved. The business community is really the foundation of our economy. Private capital is going to be the foundation of the energy transition. For sure, we're going to need a lot of public money and policy support, but without the private capital, it's just not going to happen. And so, today in my role of working with ARC Financial, which is a private equity, we're constantly looking at how investable this space is, and the business community is really going to drive the energy transition.
And I mentioned your ARC Energy Ideas podcast. I'd love to talk a bit about that, because for anyone who's listening who doesn't subscribe or regularly listen to ARC Energy Ideas, you really should. Jackie, tell me a little bit about what drew you to that medium, and have you found it to be effective as a way to talk about energy?
Well, we were early to it, believe it or not. Our very first podcast, Peter Terzakian and I are a co-host. He's my co-host. And we started that podcast in October of 2018, getting close to 5 years ago, right? So it's gone so fast. And I have to give a lot of thanks to Peter for the inspiration. For about a year before that, he was like, Jackie, we should do a podcast. And they really weren't that big of a deal at the time. And I'm like, we're so busy. We just don't have time for doing a podcast. But he was relentless. And eventually in October of 2018, we started. And it's just been such a great experience. We've covered a lot of things on our weekly podcast, even the dark days of COVID, like when oil economy was shutting down, refineries were shutting down. It's been, such a great experience. We've met so many people through the people that we've interviewed, but also through all the people that listen. And I'm sure you find that too, Scott, that people come up to you and tell you about the podcast, or, it just makes a lot of people have lots of things to tell you. And I learn a lot through it. So it's been a great experience for us.
We've enjoyed that experience too. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, people do come up and tell us that they've listened to it. If they think I've got something wrong, they usually tell me that too, which is actually delightful and invaluable as well to hear when we haven't got something quite right. And yeah, we found it to be a great medium for communicating to folks. And so, pulling deeper on that, I want to ask you about, some of the topics that you've covered on your podcast recently. One of our most recent episodes was with the geopolitical strategist, Peter Zeihan, and he talked a lot about global energy markets. I know that's something that you've covered very recently. Probably, there isn't a day that goes by in the news that we're not thinking about the war in Ukraine and what that's going to mean, particularly for energy markets. So if I could ask you, kind of cast your mind ahead, Jackie, what do you think is going to happen geopolitically this year in energy markets?
Well, it's getting harder to predict. I know one thing, there'll be a lot of volatility. 2022, let's think about that year. Like, wow, what a lot of change. We obviously had Russia invade the Ukraine, created an energy shortage by cutting off gas to Europe. Eventually, we saw some of the most important pipelines bringing gas into Europe get blown up. Billions and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that was decades in the making. People regressing to burning coal because the price of gas was so expensive. Government spending money on affordability instead of clean energy. Like there's different Reuters reports, but there's some reports that Europe spent up to $1 trillion last year on issues associated with what happened in 2022. You think about the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States that is going to be such a game changer for the investment in clean energy. And they're talking about that being $370 billion of investment over 10 years.
Well,
so just think,
$1 trillion.
yeah, like in a year, think of if that money had gone to real solutions to reducing the use of hydrocarbons, as opposed to just helping people pay their utility bills, really short-term things that didn't result in structural changes. Imagine if that money went to insulation or building way more renewable energy capacity or things like that, So I give you that framework because I think, unfortunately, the next decade probably looks more like 2022 than it did the previous decade. I really believe that we're entering an era where we're just not investing enough in hydrocarbon supply, and we're going to probably see more energy shortages, which hopefully won't be as bad as 2022, but can lead to things like people that do have hydrocarbons taking advantage of that position, more competition amongst countries, shortages and high prices. I think, volatility is for sure what the next decade looks like in my view.
So do you think that we being the globe are still chronically underinvesting in hydrocarbons and hydrocarbon production at the moment? That was one of the main drivers of this, couple of years of stronger prices that we've seen. Globally, are we still well behind the amount of investment?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, a great source to look at is the IEA, International Energy Agency, or kind of the de facto source. They put out World Energy Outlook each year, and they did actually a fairly good section on investment in oil and gas. And based on their data, we're investing on supply side, like we're going to net zero scenario, which is something like, more than half oil demand going away between now and 2040.
Yeah.
However, on the demand side, I just don't see it. I don't see us reducing demand at that rate. And so if that continues to be the situation that the supply side thinks we're going to net zero, but demand isn't there, that sets us up for, times when we just aren't going to have enough hydrocarbon supplies as we were in 2022.
And I think that's a really important message for us to sort of take on board, especially as we're sitting here talking about it with a little bit of an Alberta context. That sounds like that'll be supportive for prices over probably at least the medium term, probably an asset to those who are producers. But also I think it's kind of an important thing to communicate that, as I travel, you sort of hear the sense sometimes, why are we even talking about hydrocarbons? Aren't we kind of going to be done with those just in a handful of years? I think you're making the case very clearly that that's not going to be the case at all.
Yeah, like today, over 80% of our energy globally comes from oil, gas, and coal. We still haven't seen peak coal yet. And we've been trying to get rid of coal for a decade. So I think, it's a dual track process in our view. We definitely need to transition as quickly as we can to clean energy. But the reality is we have a whole economy based on hydrocarbons today, and we can't rebuild that overnight. For instance, we're at something like globally 14% of new car sales last year were electric. That means 85% weren't. And those cars are going to be on the road for another 14 years probably. So it takes a long time to change out the billion vehicles. And that's just light duty vehicles. Think of the infrastructure for construction, for airplanes, heavy hauling trucks, whatever you think about, it can't be changed overnight. So it will be a more gradual change in demand. And I think we do need to make sure we have hydrocarbons that can support that demand.
Let's zoom in on EVs for a moment because, you brought it up. I'd like to ask your opinion on, we've set some really aggressive targets as Canada for where we'd like to be in terms of EV sales over the course of, roughly the next decade. And that requires building the vehicles and selling the vehicles and turning over a lot of fleet. It also means a lot of materials and minerals that are going to have to be mined up. Give me your take on this, Jackie. Can we hit the goals that we've set for ourselves? Are they realistic?
Well, I definitely think the earlier goals are pretty realistic, like the 2030 goal, 2025 goal, probably pretty realistic. 100% by 2035, not sure. I'm a real believer in electric vehicles for small light duty vehicles. They work really well. I've been driving one for several years now. The cost of ownership is lower today. Sure, when you first go buy it at the dealer, it is a bit more money in many cases, but you save so much on the fuel. It cost me about $10 to fill my tank. My equivalent combustion engine vehicle cost me, $70 or $80. I mean, the price is changing all the time, but that's where you save the money on the electric vehicles. The real issue to me for adoption is actually not the cars, it's the infrastructure. Yeah. And, Western Canada is just terrible. We really don't have enough infrastructure to support people adopting them. So, I'm skeptical actually more on the infrastructure and getting that everywhere in Canada and getting very, very tight distances between charging infrastructure. Like, in Europe, they're talking about every 60 kilometers. Well, in a country the size of Canada, with the population we have, doing that over every road we have is a huge challenge. So I actually think that it's getting that infrastructure built out is probably the biggest challenge. And private capital, I'm not sure they're going to do it in a lot of areas in Canada because it just don't have the population there. So in that time frame anyway.
You can imagine how other build-outs of similar things have gone, right? And private capital is going to look at where it can, get the best return. And so you could see it concentrated in the areas where there's going to be a concentration of electric vehicles. But yeah, in some of the more far-flung areas of our province, up in Zama City or something like that, you got to ask, what's going to be the commercial incentive to build electric charging, fast charging infrastructure up there? And when you talk about infrastructure, I'm concerned about the electric vehicle infrastructure and also sort of the grid infrastructure behind that as well. I've read various estimates. Probably the best is that we're going to roughly have to double our grid infrastructure to accommodate full electrification of vehicles. And that's just something that I don't have a lot of confidence in our ability to do quickly as a country at the moment. What do you think?
Sure, there's lots of estimates out there. I think doubling is pretty high. I don't think it'll have to be anything close to that. But these are smart cars, so I think that's one thing we forget is that they're like your phone. So we can do a lot with software to change the demand profile, to have them charge at night, to have all the different users on a block, only a few cars charging at one time. I think there's a lot of solutions that are not that hard to implement there that I think are going to play a big role in reducing the need for infrastructure. But definitely along the highways, we are going to need a lot of infrastructure. That's actually where I think a big challenge will be. Like every 60 kilometers, you're going to need fast charging. And just to put it in perspective, and I'm sure it's even going to get, the fast charging requirements are going to grow. But today, like for one of the best cars, you need over 200 kilowatts for fast charging at one time, which is like 200 times the use of my home right now on average. And so you might have a bank of 20 or 30 of those every 60 to 100 kilometers, right? So it's going to, the infrastructure, building that out. And I do think along the highways, there's going to be new wires needed to support that and new equipment. I think that's going to be pretty challenging. And within the cities, we're going to need a lot of fast charging too. I just visited Surrey, BC. BC, about 20% right now of new car sales are electric. I mean, that's equal to what we're seeing in Europe in some of the big markets there. And I actually think in BC, it's probably quite a bit higher in the Lower Mainland because I don't think the people are buying them in Prince George or Kitimat. I think it's a lot concentrated in the Lower Mainland, and there are a lot
when you're on the roads there, don't you?
Yeah. There's lots on the roads, and you see the banks of like 20 plus charging ports where you just don't see that here in Alberta. By the way, it's happening there. It's happening there. People are living in apartments. They're charging at these banks. There's a lot of cars there. So I just say that because I do think it's possible and it will happen, but we are going to have to build out that infrastructure to support it.
You really paint the picture there when you're talking about the size of charging infrastructure needed at every 60 clicks. The equivalent of what the quick math that I was doing when you're talking about it, it's the equivalent of thousands of homes actually at every one of those. If it's 200 for each, even one fast charger.
Right. And they don't all charge, at that rate at the same time. But yeah, you're going to need a lot of wires and a lot of infrastructure to support, banks that large, for sure.
And I like your optimism that, we will get there. So I think, despite the fact that we talk about what some of the challenges are and we're always trying to be realistic about what timeframes things can happen on, I like that you can point to places like the lower mainland and Europe and elsewhere and say, this is where we're going, and we'll probably get there, maybe even a little bit faster than we think we're going to, because humans are pretty good at overcoming energy challenges.
Yeah, I would tell you one thing. Electric car sales right now are higher than people thought they were going to be a few years ago in terms of the percentage of new car sales. So it is actually beating the expectations people had a few years ago already. Now, North America, we're a bit of laggards, actually. I think it's only around 7% overall of new car sales are electric. I think that's going to change in the US quite drastically now with incentives that were introduced with the big Inflation Reduction Act. So
that's exactly where I wanted to ask you about next. So, the big Inflation Reduction Act in the States, talked about it a bit on this podcast, and you have as well. My view is it has actually relatively little to do with inflation reduction and quite a lot to do with energy transition, actually, which is fine. And sometimes acts are labeled for more communications reasons than they are for the substance of them. But I would say, in my view, if I was to sort of sum it up, it's thrown down a huge gauntlet in the United States to say we're going to be really aggressive about energy transition and really take an incentive-based approach. Canada needs to respond to that. And very shortly here, we'll be seeing a federal budget in Canada. What do you think we need to have in that federal budget to respond to the Inflation Reduction Act?
I think we need to see incentives that are very close, whether it be for the generation side. We're talking about 30% investment tax credits. So basically getting 30% of your capital cost back as a tax credit. And I think in some areas it'll have to be higher than that, like hydrogen, where 30% just won't get us anywhere close. One of the issues I see is in the US, they actually have a choice between investment tax credit and a production tax credit in many of the areas. And in many of the areas, the production tax credit is quite a bit better and gives you a much higher investment return than the investment tax credit. A production tax credit is for every unit you produce, whether it be electricity or hydrogen, or even for manufacturing clean energy, every solar panel you produce, you get a certain amount of money for the next 10 years. And those generally are looking much better. We had Minister Wilkinson actually on our podcast this week. You can check it out. But he gave us the sense that the production tax credit's probably not going to be there, or if it will be there, it would be for very select areas that the government wants to target, and that we can't afford to do everything that the Americans are doing. We're not the currency of the world, and we can't have a balance sheet that gets too out of whack. He's worried about the cost of these. So I appreciate that. I want us to be fiscally conservative, but at the same time, I guess we're going to have to pick winners and losers. And I don't like that either, because I'm not sure the government's always picking the areas that are ultimately where entrepreneurs are going to do the best, because he's basically saying that they're going to pick a few areas maybe where they would give that type of support. And if they don't, the areas they don't, I just can't see any investment happening here in Canada. So for example, solar panel manufacturing, which he actually said kind of didn't seem like one of the ones they would be supporting. You can basically double your profit margin by producing solar panels in the US versus Canada. Right. So I can't sort of see a lot of people staying in Canada or making new investments in Canada anyway, if that's what, the competitive economic opportunity is.
I think we have to recognize that capital is extremely mobile, right? And if the United States is offering a better sort of incentive environment, then that's most likely where it will go. I'll ask you, just pull apart a little bit further for me, if you would, Jackie, the investment tax credit versus the production tax credit. And do you feel that the production tax credit is going to be much better, or much better viewed by private capital?
Well, it really depends on the investment. So the investment tax credit is, let's say you have $100 million investment. Well, you would get $30 million today as a tax credit. You could sell that, or you could use that in your future profit, use that against your future profits to not be taxable. And so in areas where you've got a really large upfront capital cost and your operating costs are relatively small, that can make a lot of sense. And it can make sense in clean energy like wind and solar as well, depending on your utilization factors and things like that. So there are areas where it makes a lot of sense. However, there's certain areas where the production tax credit, where you just get paid for each unit you produce, is a much better incentive, providing a better return. So for example, let's look at that solar panel manufacturing. You don't pay much to put in a plant that will assemble solar panels. The cost of that equipment's pretty low. So getting 30% off that is a fairly small number compared to doubling your profit margin for the next 10 years for everything you produce, which is what the US production tax credit effectively does. So, that's a case where an investment tax credit that gives you 30% off your relatively small capital investment up front doesn't compete. So there'll be areas, hydrogen, they're offering up to $3 a kilogram for each kilogram of hydrogen you produce over the next 10 years. I just don't see, I think they talked about a 40% investment tax credit for hydrogen. I don't sort of see that won't compete with, at least for the numbers and analysis I've seen, with the production tax credit option. So there'll be certain areas where I think we can still do quite well with an investment tax credit, but certain areas where I just don't think we'll see a lot of investment without it.
So there's the discussion of production tax credit. And I've heard very similar things from our friends in Ottawa as well about, we can't compete full force with the United States in every area. So we're going to have to pick a few areas, which it sounds okay to begin with, but I share some of your same concerns about, does that mean picking winners and losers? And what's that going to mean to the areas that don't get selected? While we're talking nerdy policy stuff, one of the other things that people are really looking for from this budget is contracts for difference. Would you give us, a bit of a primer on contracts for difference and what difference that could make to this overall policy environment?
Right. Well, and we spent a bit of time on this too. And, the issue in Canada, it sounds pretty good at the front. You get, we're going to have $170 carbon tax by 2030. We now have this investment tax credit. Let's use carbon capture storage as the example of type of investment project. So we've got this investment tax credit of 50%. That's one we actually know about. More is going to come in the budget, but for that particular technology, we have knowledge that it's 50%. And so when you look at that and you run the economics, that would actually look pretty good compared to the US. They have something they call a 45Q, which was extended with the Inflation Reduction Act, but that gives you $85 a ton guaranteed for 12 years.
Right.
So ours sounds better.
You would have $170 a ton in addition to an investment tax credit. You'd think, wow, we're way more competitive.
Yeah, that sounds better. Now, the problem is the uncertainty on carbon markets and prices. So do we really know that we're going to get $170? Like, we don't know exactly what the price will be. There could be a change in government. There's also an issue is this is a market-based price. And if there's more supply in the market than demand, doesn't necessarily follow the price that the government has set. Buyers will offer sellers cheaper prices if the market gets oversupplied. And there's lots of reasons to think that there could be an oversupply, especially if a bunch of these carbon capture storage projects move forward. So what's happening is a lot of people are taking a very conservative approach. They're saying, well, because of that volatility, I really can't, first of all, I can't even get financing because most banks will say, well, that isn't a certain thing, right? So there's an issue there.
Bankable, as they would say, right?
Yeah. So because it's not a certain kind of thing, where in the US, it's like, for sure, for the next 12 years, you're going to get this price. So what we say is, Canada, generally people are discounting that maybe to a very low number. I don't know, maybe 40 or $50 is all they're assuming because of that uncertainty. And when you do it that way, now US looks better. So the contracts for differences is really, really critical, I think, to see unlock billions of dollars of investment in Canada, and a lot of it in Western Canada, because, if you're making multi-decade, multi-billion-dollar investment, like these CCS projects are very, very large. Mm-hmm. And the only way you're going to make money off them is getting paid for carbon. I think you're going to need that to see those projects get sanctioned and move forward. So I was excited to see that news that we are going to get this Canada Growth Fund. Maybe I'm saying around $15 billion. It said initially, I think you're going to need more than that to back up a lot of projects. And the idea is that if the carbon market isn't, at the minimum threshold for your project, the government would pay the difference. And so it is a little slow to get started. I understand Minister Wilkinson talked about on our podcast that the office will be set up here in a few months and start taking applications. So it's still in the future, but if that turns out the way I think it will allow us to see some sanctioning of carbon capture storage projects in Canada.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that. And I know what you mean about the sense of urgency. Our 2030 targets are only 6.5 years away at this stage. So even a few months is valuable time. But I appreciate that discussion of contracts for difference, because I think that they have the power to be really powerful and to get some projects over the finish line, as you sort of described, or at least over the final investment decision, because of the certainty that they could provide. And what's interesting is I view them as a way of sort of resolving what I had seen as kind of an argument until this point, a dueling models. One group, maybe the government would say, well, according to our model, we actually think that the credits are going to be worth pretty close to $170. So you should be just fine. Then you might have a project proponent or a company who says, well, according to our model, we think it's going to be a ton less. And I see the contracts for difference as a way of sort of, resolving that. If the government is right and the credits are very, very valuable, then there may be very little financial liability on the contracts for difference side. Or if the opposite plays out, companies can be kept whole for their investments.
Yeah, now it's definitely, one of the problems with a market-based system, like economists love them, but
Yeah.
is that, supply demand can change the price. And of course, we've got that added issue of government change here too, but which creates uncertainty. So yeah, I agree. I have sympathy for why companies aren't sanctioning the projects without it. So I'm happy to hear that hopefully we'll get a lot of clarity on how that works this year.
Absolutely. So, Jackie, earlier this month, you tweeted that Western Canada is becoming a wind and solar powerhouse. What's the state of Canada's renewable sector, and where do you see the most opportunity going in this space?
Yeah, so I'm excited about renewable opportunity. I'm actually on the Canadian Renewable Energy Association board of directors and been learning a lot over this is my second year on the board about the opportunities in all parts of Canada. Just to put it in perspective, we had 1.8 gigawatts of new projects. That's pretty big. I mean, that's about, of course, they don't produce all the time, but similar to 20% of the amount of power we consume in Alberta on average, if they were all producing at the same time. So anyway, it's a significant number for 1 year. 75% of that was actually here in Alberta. We've got a very big renewable energy sector in Alberta. And I think we often don't talk about it because we're so busy talking about oil and gas, but they're definitely generating new jobs and projects. So in terms of where it's exciting, well, Alberta, for sure. Alberta is the only place in Canada where it's an open market that people can just come and build their projects. And currently it's the only place where corporates who want to procure clean energy can come, because the rest of the country, it's a regulated market and the government puts out requests or proposals for people to bid on when they want new capacity. So, corporates today can't participate in that. So I expect to see continuing growth in Alberta. There are some worries about bottlenecks and getting tied in and things like that. But assuming all that can get resolved, I think this is going to be the biggest market for renewables in Canada. However, there's lots going on in other parts of the country. I think we're going to see a ton of growth in Quebec. I was actually just in Quebec last month and got to talk to some of the folks in their energy department. They have a different name for it, but I mean, they're expecting massive growth in renewables, and it's a pretty smart plan. They've got all that hydro. So, and they expect a lot of growth in overall energy demand. So they can use wind and solar. I think wind is actually going to be probably the primary one there. They can use the renewables when wind is blowing. And then they've got like a big battery, really, existing battery that can back those up when it's not. So I think Quebec is going to really take advantage of their renewable, which they haven't in the past, and use their hydro as the backup.
I like that way of thinking of the hydro as a battery. Basically you can, when you've got wind or solar, when you've got that kind of renewable generation, you just let the dams fill up. And then when you don't have those, you can use the water as your storage to create some power. Really fantastic partnership between those. Actually, I'm used to thinking about natural gas in that way from kind of an Alberta perspective, but I see how hydro could be that also.
Yeah. And also, they're building export lines. I know they've had some issues with some of them, but the idea is that they might be the battery for the Northeast, including the United States, as they build out more wind and solar. That's going to be a really valuable resource to back that up. Ontario is going to be a big market. They've got themselves into a pinch here where they're actually needing to bring on a lot of capacity quickly. So I think that is an area where we're going to see some growth. Maritimes as well. Saskatchewan, we're going to see, we saw the vast majority, like 98% of the growth last year in Western Canada. I think we're going to see quite a bit more growth in Eastern Canada if we go out over the next several years.
So lately, a lot of the conversation in the public has been about hydrogen, something that I didn't see talked about a lot until just a couple of years ago. Jackie, what do you see as the role that hydrogen is going to play in Canada's 2030 goals and eventually 2050 net zero goals?
Well, just put in perspective globally, hydrogen, how much do you think was spent on hydrogen last year globally?
I couldn't guess.
It was like 1 billion of the 1.1 trillion that was spent on clean energy. So just to put in perspective, it's very small today. It gets a lot of talk for the amount of capital that went into it last year. However, I do think it will play a role. I think blue hydrogen is going to be a pretty big thing in the industrial areas. And, you can see it already happening in the Edmonton area. So I think it's going to replace the use of gray hydrogen in petrochemical and refining processes. I mean, we already use a fair amount of hydrogen in those processes today, and we can clean that up. And it's all coming from natural gas, but by sequestering the CO2 that comes from that process, I think it's going to be used as a fuel in the refineries instead of natural gas. And the clean fuel standard is a real motivator. And that's a policy that's going to go live this summer. And possibly we'll see some blending of it into our overall gas system at a low fraction too. I'm not 100% sure that will happen.
Like that, or Oh, at like a 10% level I've heard or something like that. Do you imagine it could be at that level?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in Europe, you're seeing some markets where it's higher than that. Those are more like pilots right now.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think you could see some low fraction of it being blended into the existing natural gas system, at a level that doesn't require us to change out a bunch of infrastructure. So I could see that potentially happen. I think green hydrogen is going to be quite big in the United States. I think tens of billions of dollars will go into this, and I think it will be used in many of the same ways, close to big consumers of gas or gray hydrogen. And, they've got huge industrial areas like on the Gulf Coast, and the incentives for green hydrogen are so great right now. I think you're going to see a fair, that 1 billion is going to grow very soon here and be a very big number by 2030, in my view. And so those examples are where you're going to create the source of hydrogen fairly close to the demand. And you don't have a lot of infrastructure issues then in those cases. I'm more skeptical on the exports of
Mhm.
hydrogen. And I'm also more skeptical on it being used for long distance transportation just because of the time and money it's going to take to build that infrastructure. I just think that's going to take a lot of time. At the same time, electricity is getting better all the time. And, there's other options for long hauling big semis too, like biofuels or even e-fuels. And you may say those things are expensive, but building out hydrogen infrastructure across the whole country is also really expensive. So
Yeah, and I hear that all the time from many of the infrastructure companies, just the challenges that are involved in building out hydrogen infrastructure, especially long linear infrastructure or export infrastructure. It's much more difficult to do and to contain and to transport than natural gas. It's a whole different animal.
yes, yeah. So building out that whole system only for long distance vehicles that are big semis, because it's very clear to me that the light duty vehicle fleet is going electric.
Right.
And even the medium duty fleet, I mean, there's already medium duty vehicles, many brands on the road. They're working there, they have that fuel savings economics work. So I kind of am even more skeptical when I see that it's really just going to be servicing like one type of vehicle, that there'd be a return on all that infrastructure.
Right. Yeah. What a great point. I want to talk about an op-ed that you wrote in the Globe and Mail in November of last year. And Jackie, when I was reading this, I almost stood up and cheered because I agreed with virtually every point that you made in it. And it was talking about our regulatory systems in Canada. And I won't put words in your mouth. I'll ask you to describe it in your own words. But what's your view of Canada's regulatory framework for building, the types of infrastructure major projects we've been talking about?
Well, no surprise to you, Scott, but I don't see us achieving these goals of 40% reduction by 2030 or net zero by 2050 with the time it takes to build these projects and the uncertainty in the process that just chases capital away. So, I wrote the article. I mean, it's a topic that many people have written about, but I last summer actually took the time to read a book on my holiday, and I read about us building our first railway. And it was really kind of stuck with me because I'm like, well, gosh, so many of the issues they had are still the issues we have,
Environmental
except
issues, yeah, all kinds
yeah,
of, yeah,
yeah,
land.
labor shortages, issues with the weather, things that make Canada a remote place, where you got to bring in workers, it's just not that easy to build projects in Canada. However, they overcame all that and actually got the railway built in 5 years. And it was, unbelievable, really, what they achieved. And it just got me thinking, well, yeah, we still have a lot of those physical challenges that they dealt with, but now we have a regulatory process that you're lucky if you could get a project done in 10 years. It takes almost 10 years to get through the regulatory process.
Mhm.
So I argued, the pendulum's gone too far. We've got to have the pendulum swing back a little bit. Now, I argued you don't want it to go all the way back. The way we did things 140 years ago was not acceptable. And it shows why we need these regulatory processes. I mean, they had Chinese labor, almost slave labor. People were killed in it. They didn't care about Indigenous rights, no consideration for the environment. So I wasn't arguing that we go back to that, although, some people, like you were cheering, there were just a lot of people that were yelling at me too. So I mean, because a lot of people don't want to see the pendulum swing back at all. But there's just no way we can meet these goals, in my view, with the kind of timeline it's taking. And we're not the only ones. The Americans have this issue, the Europeans have this issue, and everyone's looking at it very carefully right now.
I think that analogy of a pendulum is so good, Jackie, because this is an area of policy obsession for me at the moment, and for the Business Council generally. We're working on a big report on improving our regulatory systems. But I think you've really laid out there, we can't have the pendulum swing back too far. We need these systems in place. We need to prevent bad things from happening. But maybe one of the ways that I am thinking about it, I'm interested in your reaction to this, is we put regulatory systems in place to keep bad things from happening, and we need that to still be the case. But we also now need those same systems to allow good things to happen.
Exactly. Right. And to allow capital investment, because if we want jobs, we want to reduce emissions, we need big infrastructure. Like, we're going to have to put up a lot of transmission lines. We're going to have to build things a lot faster. And I think, one thing that's unique, I mean, like I said, this regulatory permitting timelines are an issue in a lot of developed countries. But I think one of the issues that's unique in Canada is we've got this really political decision at the end, which I think chases a lot of capital away as well.
Expand on that a little bit more. Tell us about the political nature of the decision and why you think that chases away capital specifically.
Well, in Canada, you could go through a 5-year plus process, go through all the hurdles with the regulator, and then the final decision is actually political. At the end, the green light's given by either the federal environment and climate change minister or in a different process by the prime minister and his cabinet. And so, we've seen projects be canceled on political calculation before. The most famous example is the Gateway Pipeline. It had gone through something like 8 years of review. The company, was sat through, there was, very long consultations and regulatory hearings that went on for years, really. The company spent something like $400 million in that process. Mm-hmm. And at the very end, Trudeau canceled the project. It's actually on the same day he approved the Trans Mountain expansion. So so it wasn't just because he was, against pipelines, just against that pipeline. And that's a real risk, that you could spend $400 million and get nothing, and put 8 years of effort into it. And I think that's something that scares capital away from Canada. And there have been other projects that the proponent canceled the project themselves, and they never said it. But I know a big part of why they canceled it was they feared that the federal government was going to cancel it at the end. And so they just chose to cancel the project themselves, as opposed to face that, in the media and all of that. So it is definitely an issue that's affecting big capital investment in Canada, in my view.
Mm-hmm. And as you said, both in seen ways for actually, canceled projects that we know were as a result of this, and in unseen ways, projects that might be canceled or never even begun because of it. And I sort of think of that particular issue at the end of the process as related to an overall issue of just predictability. We even on this podcast, we've talked a lot about the timelines, which is very important, but I think the timelines are almost a symptom of just needing a really predictable regulatory process, being able to walk into it at the beginning, and for a company to be able to tell your board, this is how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost. And if we do all these things right, we can be reasonably certain, if not completely certain, that we're going to be successful at the end of it.
Right. Yeah. No, if you could even get rid of that wild card at the end, I think it would actually be really good. And, a lot of people may say that, this is just for oil and gas projects that this uncertainty exists. Well, I think it's going to any energy project is going to be controversial, whether it be big transmission lines, nobody likes those, big hydro dams that we're going to need to meet these goals, these big hydrogen and CO2 pipelines that may be built in the future to support these goals, they're probably going to face the same uncertainty, in my view.
What a great point. So as we bring it to a close, Jackie, there's a question we often ask a lot of guests, which is the magic wand question. We've covered a lot of ground here. You spend a lot of your time thinking about energy, but I'm going to make you pick one thing. So if I could hand you that magic wand and you could implement a policy idea to make life better for Canadians, where would you be waving it first?
It's a great question. Luckily you gave it to me ahead of time, so I had some time to think about it.
You're supposed to pretend that you just came up with a good answer off the bat. No.
This one is tough because it's really hard to think of just one policy. I'm going to have to go back and listen to your previous guests to hear what they said. I would like us to be more like Norway, which I know is going to take more than one policy, but could we just be more like Norway? They somehow have found a balanced approach. They, recognize the need for oil and gas for a long time. And if it's not going to be Norway, it'll be others. So they are going ahead and moving forward with developing oil and gas projects. But at the same time, they're quickly developing clean energy within their country. And they've got a lot of entrepreneurs that are developing technologies and things that'll be used around the world. So they've figured out this dual track. And that's, I think, what we're going to need in the next 20 years. We are going to need oil and gas. In fact, even in a net zero scenario, you do need some investment in oil and gas, because without investment, the supply actually drops faster than demand, believe it or not. So, you do need investment. And so I think, I would like us to think a bit more like Norway. They obviously aren't singularly focused on their domestic emissions. They're looking at the big picture and looking at things like energy security and global emissions, and when they're considering the decisions about their new projects.
Well, I think there's a whole host of things that you've just named there in terms of different policies, but we'll give you credit for the magic wand, because I think be a little bit more like Norway is actually a great thing if you could wave a wand with that sort of aggressive domestic focus, but also meeting the global demand, and also looking at the issue a little bit more globally than just on our artificial borders. So thank you for that, Jackie, and thanks for joining our podcast today.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Brief and Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.